Meg Hillier MP.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise because on the 6th of May 2010, my constituency of Hackney South and Shoreditch was seriously affected by what unhappily took place in other constituencies, and I'm a strong supporter, therefore, of New Clause 4, and I do hope that with the cross-party support that there has been for this across the House, that the government will make this part of, put it on the face of the bill today and make it, put it into law, because people were understandably very upset. And to give some background, first of all, there were 3 elections taking place in Hackney South and Shoreditch. We had our elected mayor up for a re-election. We had the local council elections and, of course, the general election. That meant there were 3 different types of ballot paper, all was one requiring people to vote for 3 individuals, one requiring first past the post, 1 vote for the general election, and then a preferential system for the mayoral election. So they were slightly different colours. That did require, in some cases, some explaining, and there are lessons that Hackney's learnt, which I'll touch on. But the Honourable Member for Manchester Witham did suggest that a general election should always be held as standalone elections. I just want to put on the record that I disagree with that. I think that actually, although we are all Democrats, and in this House particularly are very fond of people voting, I think that we've seen from the timing, for instance, of European elections, usually a month after May elections in this country, that it's very difficult to persuade people of the interest in coming out twice in short succession. There's also a huge cost attached to having elections at separate times when they could easily be doubled up when that makes sense, and I think that there is a real sense in having them together. And in Hackney, well, perhaps to give you some figures first, of the 6 polling stations that were affected in the borough, sadly 5 were in my own constituency. And they were the Anne Taylor Centre, which experienced one of the worst problems, the Trinity Centre, St John the Baptist Primary School in Hoxton, Comet Day Nursery, and Our Lady of St Joseph's Primary School in de Beauvoir. And those polling stations didn't have a vast number of electors, and my honourable friend, the member for Stockbridge and Penistone, has indicated that some perhaps were over-optimistic in encompassing a wider number of electors than the polling station could cope with. That wasn't the case in Hackney, where the total number, in most cases, in all cases, in my constituency, was under 2,500, so well within the tolerance levels. But there were real issues, and it became apparent. I mean, there had been queues at other points in the day in some of the polling stations, but by about 9 o'clock that night, certainly by 9:15, 9:30, it became apparent that there were serious issues. And 1 extra staff member was deployed at the Anne Taylor Centre at 9 o'clock where there were particular problems. But that was not enough at that point to deal with the scale of the problem. A whole hour before the close of poll, the queues and scale of the issue were too big for just an extra deployment of staff to deal with, which is why I'll touch on what Hackney Council has done more generally to try and solve this. But the worst affected, and estimates of those affected, obviously it is a bit of an estimate because some people, disappointed as they were, went home and may never have told us about their problems. But between 200 and 200 and 300 people roughly were affected at these 6 polling stations, of whom the majority were at the Anne Taylor Centre, where around 134 people were turned away, and there was, understandably, a small protest, and I don't defend, there was no violence happily, but there was a sit-in by some of the electors, understandably very frustrated that they couldn't exercise their democratic vote. Of course, the presiding officers were approaching the returning officer for advice, and the only advice that could be given was that if someone hasn't got a ballot paper, they cannot vote. And I won't repeat all the excellent arguments put forward by the Honourable Member for Epping Forest and my Honourable friend, the Member for Stockbridge and Penistone, but clearly that makes no sense at all. They were in the polling station. It's quite a big polling station, quite a long way from when you enter the building to when you get into the actual polling booths and polling station itself. Similarly with Our Lady and St Joseph's Primary School. But that made no common sense to those people that they lost their vote, and understandably people were very upset. Now, I think that there were some issues about Hackney handling it, and I was very impressed that the returning officer both gave up some of the money that he's received, because returning officers as chief executives will get extra money for managing elections. He acknowledged the errors, gave up that money, and I give him credit for, and met with me, I think it was on the Monday after the election, to put up his hands and say, we've got some things wrong and this is what we are now doing to resolve it. So from the moment that the election problems had happened, he started planning for the next set of elections. The changes that he's introduced, and I give him credit for this, are increasing the staff recruited, trained and accredited properly to work on elections, and he's been looking outside of the town hall as well to bring in Hackney residents, and has been overwhelmed with the interest from people to participate in our democratic process, which I think is a good thing. He's also looked at will be increasing the number of polling stations and doubling some stations and limiting the number of electors per station, as my honourable friend on the front bench indicated was important. and allocating more staff to each station with more on standby to be deployed if there is an evening rush, and there's other procedural issues around keeping in touch with returning officers and presiding officers, the presiding officers at polling stations. But if we look at the actual impact of this, in Hackney it caused distress for those who were unable to vote. But given that the majority I have in this House is substantially higher than 200 or 300 votes, it didn't have a material outcome on the result of the election. Even with the local elections, the majorities that the councillors in those wards achieved and the total number in each polling station affected would not have affected the outcome of any single one of the ballots that took place. But we all know that Mr. Deputy Speaker, that there are members in this House with majorities considerably lower than 300, considerably lower than 200 or even 100 in some cases, where simply in some cases 92 voters not being able to vote could have had an impact on the outcome of the election. Then, if we don't change the law, and that happens in a seat with exactly that same situation, we would face the added public expense. I give way to my other friend.
I thought my uncle said a different way, and to illustrate the point she's making, would point out that in Sheffield Central, which fortunately did not have a problem, despite all the other constituencies around it experiencing problems, the majority is only 165, which I think totally underlines her point.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I just think we need to make sure that we tighten this law now to make it fairer for electors. And actually, I think electors would also be upset at the idea of having not just the expense of another election, but of coming out again. How that could affect an election result and the will of the people, I think, is a real serious concern. So rather than repeat the excellent arguments that have been made, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I rest my case there. I really seriously hope that the government will introduce this change in this bill to make sure that electors in Hackney South and Shoreditch never have to experience this terrible experience again.
Jones.